What happens to your body when you do deadlift every day? One popular difficult exercise using weights is the deadlift. It works wonders to build strength by engaging the biggest muscles in the legs and lower back. I'll explain in this video what happens to your body if you deadlift every day. Watch the video through to the finish. It's worth it. Now let's move. All of the muscular groups are worked during the deadlift. However, the legs, or more specifically, the back of the thigh and the back are worked first. Moreover, this exercise uses the abs as stabilizers. In addition to the hands receiving a good static load, the trapezium and forearms are perfectly loaded. Now let's discuss the remaining benefits of deadlifting. One of the finest workouts for strengthening the hip extensors is the deadlift. These comprise the rear of the thigh muscles and the gluteus maximus. Studies suggest that when it comes to strengthening these muscles, deadlifts could be more beneficial than squats. Nonetheless, the barbell squat is a crucial part of a well-rounded training routine and offers benefits over the deadlift. Men and women equally frequently complain of low back pain. Research shows that a deadlift might be a useful technique to lessen the symptoms of moderate lower back pain, even though several reasons for this condition call for different types of treatment. It is important to remember that proper deadlift technique and a neutral spine position are requirements for the workout not to worsen the pain. Nonetheless, before beginning a deadlift plan as part of your lower back pain therapy, speak with a doctor. One of the most important abilities is jumping, and how well you can leap usually indicates how strong your lower body has become overall. Studies show that the improvement in maximal leaping outcomes is the clear benefit of the deadlift. One of the most prevalent effects of aging and a major health issue that older adults deal with is decreased bone mineral density. Osteoporosis, which significantly raises the risk of fractures in the elderly, is brought on by a significant decrease in bone mineral density. Strength training has been shown in several studies to be beneficial in delaying the age-related decline of bone mineral density. The trained body part has a direct correlation with the location of enhanced bone density. The most significant remineralization of bone tissue will happen, namely in the region of the muscles used to carry out this activity. Because the deadlift works the hips and legs, it's beneficial to combine it with other strength training exercises to prevent or reverse the loss of bone mineral density that comes with aging. Core muscle training is an essential component of a well-rounded exercise plan. Studies have shown that the benefits of performing deadlifts and other free weight workouts encompass the stimulation and fortification of the back-stabilizing muscles, including the rectus abdominis, erectors of the spine, and external oblique. A typical goal for many people who exercise is to lose weight. To lose weight, especially fat, you have to burn more calories in a given amount of time than you take in. Conventional weight loss plans use changes in diet to lower caloric intake and physical exercise to raise caloric expenditure. Research indicates that deadlifts are a clear choice for efficiently raising energy expenditure through exercise. These kinds of workouts, when combined with strength training, can be one of the best ways to burn more calories while spending less time in the gym overall. Because there is a significant danger of injury, it is crucial to follow proper technique when executing a deadlift. Let's analyze the method of execution. Set your feet apart by hip width. Tilt your body, pull your hips back, and use both hands to hold the barbell. Look forward while erecting your shoulders and chest. Lift the barbell after tensing your back muscles and arching your lower back. Lower the bar by shifting your pelvis back and bending your knees just a little bit. Throughout the deadlift, make sure your back is constantly straight. If you find it difficult to keep this posture and find yourself bending down, you are likely taking on too much weight. Additionally, there are a number of limitations, such as issues with the knees, spine, and so on. Furthermore, the deadlift is not advised for those with high blood pressure or heart problems since it places a great deal of stress on the cardiovascular system. By the way, friends, be sure to watch other videos on this channel. Videos are on the screen right now. And also don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. See you on the next video.